Carl Gustav Jung writes, "We have no symbolic life, and we are all badly in need of the symbolic life. Only the symbolic life can express the need of the soul, the daily need of the soul, mind you. And because people have no such thing, they can never step out of this mill, this awful, banal, grinding life in which they are nothing but. Everything is banal, everything is nothing but. And that is the reason why people are neurotic. They are simply sick of the whole thing, sick of that banal life, and therefore they want sensation. They even want a war. They all want a war. They are all glad when there is a war. They say, 'Thank heaven. Now something is going to happen, something bigger than ourselves.' These things go pretty deep. And no wonder people get neurotic. Life is too rational. There is no symbolic existence in which I am something else, in which I am fulfilling my role as one of the actors in the divine drama of life." I once had a talk with the master of ceremonies of a tribe of Pueblo Indians, and he told me something very interesting. He said, "Yes, we are a small tribe, and these Americans, they want to interfere with our religion. They should not do it," he said, "because we are the sons of the Father, the Son. He who goes there, pointing to the sun, that is our Father. We must help him daily to rise over the horizon and to walk over heaven. And we don't do it for ourselves only. We do it for America. We do it for the whole world. And if these Americans interfere with our religion through their missions, they will see something. In 10 years, Father Son won't rise anymore, because we can't help him anymore." Now you may say that is just a sort of mild madness. Not at all. These people have no problems. They have their daily life, their symbolic life. They get up in the morning with a feeling of their great and divine responsibility. They are the sons of the Son, the Father, and their daily duty is to help the Father over the horizon. Not for themselves alone, but for the whole world. You should see these fellows. They have a natural fulfilled dignity. And I quite understand when he said to me, "Now look at these Americans. They are always seeking something. They are always full of unrest, always looking for something. What are they looking for? There is nothing to be looked for." That's perfectly true. You can see them, these traveling tourists, always looking for something, always in the vain hope of finding something. On my many travels, I have found people who were on their third trip around the world, uninterruptedly, just traveling, seeking. I met a woman in Central Africa who had come up alone in a car from Cape Town and wanted to go to Cairo. "What for?" I asked. "What are you trying to do that for?" And I was amazed when I looked into her eyes, the eyes of a hunted, a cornered animal, seeking, always in the hope of something. I said, "What in the world are you seeking? What are you waiting for? What are you hunting after?" She is nearly possessed. She is possessed by so many devils that chase her around. And why is she possessed? Because she does not live the life that makes sense. Hers is a life utterly grotesquely banal, utterly poor, meaningless. With no point in it at all. If she is killed today, nothing has happened, nothing has vanished, because she was nothing. But if she could say, I am the daughter of the moon. Every night I must help the moon. My mother, over the horizon. Ah, that is something else. Then she lives. Then her life makes sense. And makes sense in all continuity. And for the whole of humanity. That gives peace. This was written by Dr. Ian McGilchrist over 10 years ago. A world in which left brain dominance has won out. The impersonal would come to replace the personal. There would be a focus on material things at the expense of the living, social cohesion, and the bonds between person and person, and just as importantly between person and place. The context in which each person belongs would be neglected, perhaps actively disrupted, as both inconvenient and incomprehensible to the left hemisphere, acting on its own. Resentment would lead to an emphasis on uniformity. Identification would be by categories, socioeconomic groups, races, sexes, and so on, which would also feel themselves to be implicitly or explicitly in competition with, resentful of one another. Paranoia and lack of trust would come to be the pervading stance within society, both between individuals and between such groups, and would be the stance of government towards its people. Reasonableness would be replaced by rationality, and perhaps the very concept of reasonableness might become unintelligible. There would be a complete failure of common sense, since it is intuitive and relies on both hemispheres working together. Anger and aggressive behavior would become more evident in our social interactions, since of all emotional states, these are the most highly characteristic of the left hemisphere, and would no longer be counterbalanced by the empathic skills of the right hemisphere. One would expect a loss of insight, coupled with an unwillingness to take responsibility, and this would reinforce the left hemisphere's tendency to a perhaps dangerously unwarranted optimism or positivity. Pink fluffy unicorn stuff. Not wanting to do your own research. Not think critically or looking at both sides of a coin, not just one side. Confirmation bias. Cognitive dissonance. There would be a rise in intolerance and inflexibility, an unwillingness to change track or change one's mind. Above all, the word and the idea would come to dominate, regardless of how much evidence you would present, how much logic. It's really strange. There is a wall between you and this person that is brainwashed. And no matter what you say, they seem like addicts, and they will completely block you out. Their drug of choice has become their one and only occupation. And what you say doesn't matter. Cultural history and tradition, and what can be learned from the past, would be confidently dismissed in preparation for a systematic society of the future, put together by human will. The body would come to be viewed as a machine. Transhumanism, for example, and the natural world as a heap of resource to be exploited. For example, Mao, he was, as far as I know, a peasant son, but he completely disregarded nature. And the result of that was the Big Famine. So there are many such examples. Whenever humans fight nature, disregard it, it will strike back in one way or another. You have to live with and along with nature.
As human beings, we tend to look for things that confirms how we look at the world. And we sort of continuously just push out stuff that doesn't fit with our preconception.
The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduced them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim.
Public opinion is big business. As of 2011, there were more than 7,000 public relations firms in the United States alone. These companies work on behalf of corporations, trade organizations, or individuals who hope to put a positive spin on their image. Combating negative press, chances are you've recently encountered PR work and you might not have known. There's no denying the importance of this multi-billion-dollar industry. But what exactly is it? How does it work? And who invented it? Here's where it gets crazy. The art of modern public relations can be generally traced to one man, Edward Bernays. There were other, earlier innovators, but none altered the social landscape of North America as profoundly. Born in Vienna, Austria in 1891, Bernays' family moved to New York City about a year after his birth. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and like his uncle, Bernays was captivated by the convoluted processes of the human mind. Bernays often consulted his uncle's work, and he was the first to incorporate psychology and other social sciences into PR. Yet where Freud sought to uncover motivations, Bernays sought to mask them. And Bernays' clients were companies rather than individuals. For example, one of his early cases involved Lucky Strike cigarettes in the 1920s. The American Tobacco Company asked him to expand sales. Women would be an ideal market, but there were problems. First, women didn't care for the green packaging of Lucky Strikes, and the manufacturer concluded that changing the color was too expensive. Second, it was taboo for women to smoke in public. Bernays took a unique approach to these obstacles. First, he recommended that, if the packs must stay green, they should make green the premier color of the fashion season. During his Green Ball campaign, Bernays convinced French designers to incorporate green into their latest fashion lines, and not just any green, but the specific dark green shade of Lucky Strike packaging. He also engineered a green gala at the Waldorf Astoria featuring some of society's most prominent tastemakers. To address the problem of smoking in public, he linked Lucky Strike cigarettes to the women's liberation movement, arranging for young women to march down Fifth Avenue, smoking and calling the cigarettes torches of freedom.
This is all wrong. How dare you? The more I started looking, the more ridiculous nonsense I started realizing that maybe this is a distraction.
Programming your behavior. Brainwashing you through their propaganda and censorship of anything that goes against that propaganda. Be vigilant. Edward Bernays called it torches of freedom.
According to the psychologist Carl Jung, the greatest threat to civilization lies not with the forces of nature, nor with any physical disease, but with our inability to deal with the forces of our own psyche. We are our own worst enemies, or as the Latin proverb puts it, man is a wolf to man. In Civilization in Transition, Jung states that this proverb is a sad yet eternal truism, and our wolf-like tendencies come most prominently into play at those times of history when mental illness becomes the norm rather than the exception in a society, a situation which Jung termed a psychic epidemic. Indeed, it is becoming ever more obvious, he writes, that it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself, who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. In this video, we are going to explore the most dangerous of all psychic epidemics, the mass psychosis. A mass psychosis is an epidemic of madness, and it occurs when a large portion of a society loses touch with reality and descends into delusions. Such a phenomenon is not a thing of fiction. Two examples of mass psychoses are the American and European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, and the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century. During the witch hunts, thousands of individuals, mostly women, were killed, not for any crimes they committed, but because they became the scapegoats of societies gone mad. In some Swiss villages, writes Francis Hill, there were scarcely any women left alive after the frenzy had finally burned itself out. When a mass psychosis occurs, the results are devastating. Jung studied this phenomenon and wrote that the individuals who make up the infected society become morally and spiritually inferior. They sink unconsciously to an inferior intellectual level. They become more unreasonable, irresponsible, emotional, erratic, and unreliable, and worst of all, crimes the individual alone could never stand are freely committed by the group smitten by madness. What makes matters worse is that those suffering from a mass psychosis are unaware of what is occurring. For just as an individual gone mad cannot step out of his mind to observe the errors in his ways, so too there is no Archimedean point from which those living through a mass psychosis can observe their collective madness. But what causes a mass psychosis? To answer this question, we must first explore what drives an individual mad. While there are many potential triggers of madness, such as an excessive use of drugs or alcohol, brain injuries, and other illnesses, physical causes will not concern us here. Our concern is with psychological, or what are called psychogenic triggers, as these are the most common culprits of the mass psychosis. The most prevalent psychogenic cause of a psychosis is a flood of negative emotions, such as fear or anxiety, that drives an individual into a state of panic. When in a state of panic, an individual will naturally seek relief, as it is too mentally and physically draining to subsist in this hyper-emotional state. While escaping from the state of panic can be accomplished through adaptive means, such as facing up to and defeating the fear-generating threat, another way to escape is to undergo a psychotic break. A psychotic break is not a descent into a state of greater disorder, as many believe, but a reordering of one's experiential world, which blends fact and fiction, or delusions and reality, in a way that helps end the feelings of panic. Silvano Arietti, one of the 20th century's foremost authorities on schizophrenia, explains the psychogenic steps that lead to madness. Firstly, there is the phase of panic, when the patient starts to perceive things in a different way, is frightened on account of it, appears confused, and does not know how to explain the strange things that are happening. The next step is what Arietti calls a phase of psychotic insight, whereby an individual succeeds in putting things together by devising a pathological way of seeing reality which allows him to explain his abnormal experiences. The phenomenon is called insight because the patient finally sees meaning and relations in his experiences. But the insight is psychotic because it is based on delusions, not on adaptive and life-promoting ways of relating to whatever threats precipitated the panic. The delusions, in other words, allow the panic-stricken individual to escape from the flood of negative emotions, but at the cost of losing touch with reality, and for this reason, Arietti says that a psychotic break can be viewed as an abnormal way of dealing with an extreme state of anxiety.
The infamous Salem witch trials began during the spring of 1692, after a group of young girls in Salem Village, Massachusetts, claimed to be possessed by the devil and accused several local women of witchcraft. As a wave of hysteria spread throughout colonial Massachusetts, a special court convened in Salem to hear the cases. The first convicted witch, Bridget Bishop, was hanged that June. 18 others followed Bishop to Salem's Gallows Hill, while some 150 more men, women and children were accused over the next several months. By September 1692, the hysteria had begun to abate, and public opinion turned against the trials. Though the Massachusetts General Court later annulled guilty verdicts against accused witches and granted indemnities to their families, bitterness lingered in the community. Context and origins of the Salem witch trials. Belief in the supernatural and specifically in the devil's practice of giving certain humans, witches, the power to harm others in return for their loyalty had emerged in Europe as early as the 14th century and was widespread in colonial New England. In addition, the harsh realities of life in the rural Puritan community of Salem Village, present-day Danvers, Massachusetts, at the time included the after-effects of a British war with France in the American colonies in 1689, a recent smallpox epidemic, fears of attacks from neighboring Native American tribes, and a long-standing rivalry with the more affluent community of Salem town, present-day Salem. Amid these simmering tensions, the Salem witch trials would be fueled by residents' suspicions of and resentment toward their neighbors. Does that sound familiar? As well as their fear of outsiders.
If a panic-triggering flood of negative emotions in a weak and vulnerable individual can trigger a psychotic break, then a mass psychosis can result when a population of weak and vulnerable individuals is driven into a state of panic by threats real, imagined, or fabricated. But as delusions can take many forms, and as madness can manifest in countless ways, the specific manner in which a mass psychosis unfolds will differ based on the historical and cultural context of the infected society. But in the modern era, it is the mass psychosis of totalitarianism that appears to be the greatest threat. Totalitarianism, writes Arthur Versluis, is the modern phenomenon of total centralized state power, coupled with the obliteration of individual human rights. In the totalized state, there are those in power, and there are the objectified masses, the victims. In a totalitarian society, the population is divided into two groups, the rulers and the ruled, and both groups undergo a pathological transformation. The rulers are elevated to an almost godlike status, which is diametrically opposed to our nature as imperfect beings who are easily corrupted by power. The masses, on the other hand, are transformed into the dependent subjects of these pathological rulers and take on a psychologically regressed and childlike status. Hannah Arendt, one of the 20th century's preeminent scholars of this form of rule, called totalitarianism an attempted transformation of human nature itself.
Was mich und Menschen meiner Generation betrifft, kann ich sagen, dass es eine kuriose Missverständnis ist. Das war natürlich sehr schlimm. Es war politisch, es war nicht persönlich. Dass die Nazis unsere Feinde sind, mein Gott, wir brauchten doch bitteschön nicht Hitlers Machtergreifung, um das zu wissen. Das war doch seit mindestens 4 Jahren jedem Menschen, der nicht schwachsinnig war, völlig evident. Dass ein großer Teil des deutschen Volkes dahinter stand, ja, das wussten wir ja auch. Davon konnten wir doch nicht 33 schockartig überrascht sein.
Sie meinen, der Schock lag im Jahr 33 darin, dass es vom allgemein Politischen ins Persönliche gewendet wurde?
Nein, nicht mal. Erst das auch. Erstens wurde das allgemein Politische ja eine persönliche Schicksal, sofern man herausging, nicht?
Ja.
Zweitens aber wissen Sie ja, was Gleichschaltung ist. Und das hieß, dass die Freunde sich gleichschalten.
Ja.
Es hat doch niemals das Problem, das persönliche Problem, war doch nicht etwa, was unsere Feinde taten, sondern was unsere Freunde taten. Nun gut. Was damals in der Welle von Gleichschaltungen, die ja ziemlich freiwillig war, jedenfalls noch nicht unter dem Druck des Terrors, vor allen Dingen aber in dem plötzlichen Verlassen. Es war, als ob sich ein leerer Raum um einen bildete.
Or as we call it in the attachment world, he is dealing without feeling. He has learned to cut off his emotions. You don't really want to hang out with people who have that particular way of coping with the world, who have learned to deal but not feel. I think people who run universities and people who run insurance companies may sometimes be people like that. But you really want to be with people who have a feeling of pain and hurt and sorrow and joy, and for whom all of that has not been cut off.
Nun, ich lebte in einem intellektuellen Milieu. Und ich kannte aber auch andere Menschen. Und ich konnte feststellen, dass unter Intellektuellen das sozusagen die Regel war. Und unter den anderen nicht. Und die Geschichte habe ich nie vergessen. Und mit einer Sache ging ich raus aus Deutschland. Wie ich damals dachte, natürlich immer etwas übertreibend. Nie wieder. Ich rühre nie wieder irgendeine intellektuelle Geschichte an. Ich will mit dieser Gesellschaft nichts zu tun haben. Ich war ja natürlich nicht der Meinung, dass also nun deutsche Juden oder deutsch-jüdische Intellektuelle, wenn sie in einer anderen Situation gewesen wären, als in der sie waren, sich wesentlich anders verhalten würden. Der Meinung war ich nicht. Ich war der Meinung, das hängt mit diesem Beruf zusammen. Ich spreche in der Vergangenheit, ich weiß heute mehr darüber als damals.
Ich wollte Sie fragen, glauben Sie das noch?
Ja, wissen Sie, nicht mehr in dieser Schärfe. Aber dass es im Wesen dieser ganzen Sachen liegt, dass man sich sozusagen zu jeder Sache etwas einfallen lassen kann. Die Leute sind doch, sehen Sie, dass jemand sich gleichschaltete, weil er für Frau und Kind zu sorgen hat, das hat ihm nie ein Mensch übergenommen. Das Schlimme war doch, dass sie dann wirklich daran glaubten. Für kurze Zeit, manche für sehr kurze Zeit. Das heißt, zu Hitler fiel ihnen was ein. Und zum Teil ungeheuer interessante Dinge. Nicht? Ganz fantastisch interessante und komplizierte und hoch über dem gewöhnlichen Niveau schwebende Dinge. Das habe ich als grotesk empfunden. Das heißt, sie gingen ihren eigenen Einfällen in die Falle, würde ich heute sagen. Nicht, das ist das, was passiert ist.
But this attempted transformation only turns sound minds into sick minds. For as the Dutch medical doctor who studied the mental effects of living under totalitarianism wrote, "There is in fact much that is comparable between the strange reactions of the citizens of totalitarianism and their culture as a whole, on the one hand, and the reactions of the sick schizophrenic on the other. The social transformation that unfolds under totalitarianism is built upon and sustained by delusions. For only deluded men and women regress to the childlike status of obedient and submissive subjects, and hand over complete control of their lives to politicians and bureaucrats. Only a deluded ruling class will believe that they possess the knowledge, wisdom, and acumen to completely control society in a top-down manner. And only when under the spell of delusions would anyone believe that a society composed of power-hungry rulers on the one hand, and a psychologically regressed population on the other, will lead to anything other than mass suffering and social ruin. But what triggers the psychosis of totalitarianism? As was explored in the previous video of this series, the mass psychosis of totalitarianism begins in a society's ruling class. The individuals that make up this class, be it politicians, bureaucrats, or crony capitalists, are very prone to delusions that augment their power, and no delusion is more attractive to the power-hungry than the delusion that they can and should control and dominate a society. When a ruling elite becomes possessed by a political ideology of this sort, be it communism, fascism, or technocracy, the next step is to induce a population into accepting their rule by infecting them with the mass psychosis of totalitarianism. This psychosis has been induced many times throughout history, and as Mirlu explains, it is simply a question of reorganizing and manipulating collective feelings in the proper way. The general method by which the members of a ruling elite can accomplish this end is called menticide, with the etymology of this word being a killing of the mind, and as Mirlu further explains, menticide is an old crime against the human mind and spirit, but systematized anew. It is an organized system of psychological intervention and judicial perversion through which a ruling class can imprint their own opportunistic thoughts upon the minds of those they plan to use and destroy. Priming a population for the crime of menticide begins with the sowing of fear. When an individual is flooded with negative emotions, such as fear or anxiety, he or she is very susceptible to a descent into the delusions of madness. Threats, real, imagined, or fabricated, can be used to sow fear, but a particularly effective technique is to use waves of terror. Under this technique, the sowing of fear is staggered with periods of calm, but each of these periods of calm is followed by the manufacturing of an even more intense spell of fear, and on the process goes. Or as Mirlu writes, each wave of terrorizing creates its effects more easily after a breathing spell than the one that preceded it, because people are still disturbed by their previous experience. Morality becomes lower and lower, and the psychological effects of each new propaganda campaign become stronger. It reaches a public already softened up. While fear primes a population for menticide, the use of propaganda to spread misinformation and to promote confusion with respect to the source of the threats and the nature of the crisis helps to break down the minds of the masses.
One of the most ridiculous campaigns during Mao's regime was to eliminate the 4 pests. Children were given a real role in the posters that flanked the campaign that set out to exterminate the so-called 4 pests. The aim of this large-scale hygiene campaign, which started in earnest 1958 and is often seen as an overture for the nationwide mobilization of the Great Leap Forward, was to eliminate flies, mosquitoes, rats, and sparrows. Sparrows were later replaced by bedbugs, as the extermination of the former upset the ecological balance, and bugs destroyed crops as a result of the absence of natural predators. To attain the aim of the elimination of the four pests, everybody was mobilized. Contests were held among enterprises, government agencies and schools in cleanliness. Non-material rewards were given to those who handed in the largest number of tails of rats or dead flies and mosquitoes or dead sparrows. As the movement became something of a sport, children turned out to be a group that jumped at the excitement of these activities and were eminently receptive to the calls for mobilization. Eyewitnesses recall from their youth how they would bang pots and pans so that sparrows would not have the chance to rest on tree branches and would fall dead from the sky from exhaustion. The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1961. As a result of the successful economic reconstruction that had taken place in the early 1950s under the first five-year plan, the party leadership headed by Mao Zedong considered the conditions ripe for a great leap forward. In early 1958, the Great Leap was not merely a bold economic project, it was also intended to show the Soviet Union that the Chinese approach to economic development was more vibrant and ultimately would be more successful than the Soviet model that had been followed studiously until then. The Chinese people were to go all out in a concerted effort to surpass England in 15 or even less years and to make the transition from socialism to communism at the same time, thereby leaving the Soviet Union far behind. That, at least, was the plan, which brought to an abrupt stop the earlier, more cautious attempts to sustain the speed of China's recovery and further development by five-year plans. The more radical members of the leadership tried to outdo each other with more and more unrealistic calls for greater, faster, better, and cheaper production. The characters for this call are emblazoned on the sails of the ship in the poster below. The poster also tries to impress on the population how all this will improve their welfare. Empty promises. On the basis of an exaggerated belief in the power of ideology on human consciousness, it's always ideology. The radicals were convinced that by putting politics in command, the objective difficulties created by lagging industrialization and mechanization could be overcome in a relatively short time. By relying on willpower and by giving supremacy to the human subjective dimensions of history, the people would be able to bring about a quick transformation of the concrete obstacles they encountered in the physical world. To mobilize this willpower, the Great Leap Forward obviously was accompanied by a concerted propaganda effort, the depths and breadth of which had hitherto not been seen. The Great Leap Forward took two forms: a mass steel campaign and the formation of the people's communes. On the one hand, all the people in the country were organized to help produce the amount of steel that was needed to attain the goal of surpassing England. Life was militarized for this battle for steel. Everywhere, small backyard furnaces were built, where everybody pitched in around-the-clock shifts. Quota for the collection of used iron had to be met. Cooking pots were smashed. Door handles were melted down in order to meet the production demands. I mean, this already shows so much stupidity. Only later it became clear that the quality of this mass-produced people's steel was so poor that no use could be found for it. And they lost all their cooking pots and door handles for that. The effects of this production battle proved to be disastrous for the environment. On the poster below, rows of such small backyard furnaces can be seen. In the countryside, the various forms of rural cooperatives were merged into huge people's communes. Rural life was completely collectivized, including mess halls, where free food was supplied. Due to the excessive zeal of local officials, who were whipped up in the general atmosphere of enthusiasm, while at the same time afraid to be branded as laggards, production figures that were unrealistic to begin with were fixed higher and higher. Moreover, because everybody was involved in the battle to produce steel, labor power was lacking to bring in the harvests. If these amounts of food really could have been harvested, as the enthusiastic reports had promised, communism was just around the corner, as the general belief in the autumn of 1958 seemed to be. By early 1959, it became clear that things were running out of hand. As a result of the massive production drives in steel and agriculture, both the production and transport sectors had become severely dislocated. The reality of the Great Leap Forward corresponded less and less with the picture painted in the reports to the leadership. Some leaders, including Chen Yun, started to express cautious warnings about the results of this fever in the brain, which held China in its sway, while the more radical officials continued to proclaim imaginary victories in production. Dissatisfaction climaxed at the Lushan plenum in July 1959. Originally, the meeting was intended to rein in the leftism of the movement, but it turned into a showdown between proponents of the movement headed by Mao and opponents inadvertently headed by Minister of Defense Peng Dehuai. In a personal letter to Mao, Peng had criticized the extreme elements of the movement, which were absolutely right. But, of course, a sociopath like Mao interpreted the letter as a personal attack and had it distributed for study and criticism by the other leaders present at Lushan. This is the narcissism that leads to more destruction. And that's why a sociopath or psychopath should never be the leader of people. Mao interpreted the letter as a personal attack. As a result of the plenum, Peng was dismissed from his posts and replaced by Lin Biao. Instead of trying to find answers to the problems of the Great Leap, an anti-rightist struggle was started. They could have prevented this famine if they had listened. Despite the indications that the Great Leap had failed to reach its objectives, the movement continued to be upheld. This is so typical for communism or fascism: denial and downplaying of things, never acknowledging one's guilt, but pointing towards another scapegoat. On top of that, narcissist leaders kind of always have a fear of shame. And in China, this is coupled with losing faith. It's nowhere that extreme as in China. So they will do everything, lie and deny and cover up all the mistakes they have done, just to save face. It's really extreme. The movement turned into a disaster when, in the period 1959 to 1961, China was struck by natural disasters. More than estimated 30 to 40 million people died in the ensuing famine. One of the essential aspects of propaganda is that it should reflect reality, while at the same time providing an optimistic outlook of what lies ahead. The posters below, all published in 1960, believed that actually had been taking place and continued to provide a surreal picture of life. And then followed the Cultural Revolution, just to keep Mao in charge. Down with imperialism. As China is recovering from the famine, a battle for power is raging behind the scenes of the Communist Party, between left and right. Propaganda becomes more fierce and intense. For now, the themes of the posters lie outside China itself: struggle against internationalism and the USA, support for Vietnam. In hindsight, it looks like a rehearsal for the Cultural Revolution. And then 10 years of madness. The Cultural Revolution was a mass campaign of enormous dimensions. Aside from the general revolutionary high tide that swept China, the period was marked by a large number of sub-campaigns. Indeed, whenever the situation called for a shift in orientation within the larger framework of the Cultural Revolution, This was engineered by setting in motion a new campaign. Factional struggles within the leadership also functioned as catalysts for campaigns. Locally produced posters are extremely interesting, not only because they shed light on the local situation, but also from an artistic point of view. They are often striking in their simplicity of design and coloring, usually done in simple red, white and black, and are somewhat reminiscent of the block prints made in the war years. As such, they bear witness to the urgency of the time. So this is all propaganda. Develop the basket on the back spirit. Serve the people wholeheartedly. The Chinese people have high aspirations. Of course, you don't want to stand out as sore thumb, right? Win honor for our great leader Chairman Mao. Bring credit to our socialist motherland. Prepare for struggle, prepare for famine, for the people. It's always for the people. Individualism is completely eradicated.
Government officials and their lackeys in the media can use contradictory reports, nonsensical information, and even blatant lies, as the more they confuse, the less capable will a population be to cope with the crisis and diminish their fear in a rational and adaptive manner. Confusion, in other words, heightens the susceptibility of a descent into the delusions of totalitarianism, or as Mirlu explains, logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal than logic and reason. While the people are still searching for a reasonable counter-argument to the first lie, the totalitarians can assault them with another. Never before in history have such effective means existed to manipulate a society into the psychosis of totalitarianism. Smartphones and social media, television and the internet, all in conjunction with algorithms that quickly censor the flow of unwanted information, allow those in power to easily assault the minds of the masses. What is more, the addictive nature of these technologies means that many people voluntarily subject themselves to the ruling elite's propaganda with a remarkable frequency. Modern technology, explains Mirlu, teaches man to take for granted the world he is looking at. He takes no time to retreat and reflect. Technology lures him on, dropping him into its wheels and movements. No rest, no meditation, no reflection, no conversation. The senses are continually overloaded with stimuli. Man doesn't learn to question his world anymore. The screen offers him answers, ready-made. But there is a further step the would-be totalitarian rulers can take to increase the chance of a totalitarian psychosis. And this is to isolate the victims and to disrupt normal social interactions. When alone and lacking normal interactions with friends, family, and co-workers, an individual becomes far more susceptible to delusions for several reasons. Firstly, they lose contact with the corrective force of the positive example, for not everyone is tricked by the machinations of the ruling elite, and the individuals who see through the propaganda can help free others from the menticidal assault. If, however, isolation is enforced, the power of these positive examples greatly diminishes. But another reason that isolation increases the efficacy of menticide is because, like many other species, human beings are more easily conditioned into new patterns of thought and behavior when isolated.
We humans are still social animals, and isolated, we tend to cave in.
Talk more about communism, and I thought I found a good article that gives me the opportunity to do so. Now, the main issue that I have with communism is that in order for it to happen, you need to go through socialism. And socialism is a system of government where the state controls the means of production. So the state pretty much controls the economy. And in order for it to do so, it gives all the power into the hands of a few people. And regardless of political ideology, whether it is a theocracy, whether you're talking about fascismus, whether you're talking about socialismus, all of them that give the power in the hands of a couple of people, those people will always abuse the power because they are not held accountable by anything anymore. So this is why a lot of people will say, well, that wasn't real socialism, that wasn't real communism. They look at China and they say, well, that's not what communism should be like. And the reality is that whenever you have someone promising socialism, they promise you the utopia, the moment they get into power, they are very tempted not to deliver the utopia. And there is no consequences for them if they don't deliver it. If you want to know just how severe things were, you need to take into account that the son of the dictator, Ceausescu, literally ran over a woman with his car. He killed a woman and didn't suffer the consequences for it because the press covered it up. There was no scandal. The judges were told by the party to look the other way, and people didn't find out about this until after the regime fell and a lot of the paperwork was revealed. Another problem that I have with communism is the intention of thought policing people. Because there is no more governmental institution that can keep the dictators and the higher-ups in check, the only ones that could possibly keep the dictator in check would be the people. And the dictator knows that, the inner party member know that, and they are the ones that are going to make sure that the people are being suppressed so they don't rise up when the dictator makes a bad decision. Now, in order to do this, they're going to use thought policing. Now, thought policing is cruel and unjust, is because even if we were to agree that certain thoughts should be removed from the public psyche, we notice that it does immense collateral damage when applied. You see, when you police someone's action, it is something objective. A person can be proven to have done a certain action, and as such, there is beyond any shadow of a doubt that he is guilty. But when it comes to thought policing, and the communists try to root out counter-revolutionary thinking, capitalist thinking, Nazi thinking, and you know, like all the buzzwords that they have, they usually aren't sure if a person is actually a counter-revolutionary or not. A simple joke, a simple thing said in jest, a quote that is misinterpreted could now be considered the person to have committed a thought crime. They didn't call it a thought crime, they would call it like anti-revolutionary agitation, but it was pretty much that. So if we look at policing actions, you know, someone steals something, you can have a camera that shows the person stealing, you can have witnesses that show the person committing the crime. But when it's about thought policing, well, the person said a joke. Is he really a counter-revolutionary, or was he trying to be edgy? We don't know, but the government always erred on the side of caution, police those people. So this is why I would consider the main reason that I had disdain for communism. Lack of accountability for the leaders, all of the power in the state in the hands of a couple of people that got to decide how you think, what you say, how your life is going to be. And then the thought policing, which was very, very cruel, very brutal.
Or as Myrlu explains with regards to the physiologist Ivan Pavlov's work on behavioral conditioning, Pavlov made another significant discovery. The conditioned reflex could be developed most easily in a quiet laboratory with a minimum of disturbing stimuli. Every trainer of animals knows this from his own experience. Isolation and the patient repetition of stimuli are required to tame wild animals. The totalitarians have followed this rule. They know that they can condition their political victims most quickly if they are kept in isolation. Alone, confused, and battered by waves of terror, a population under an attack of menticide descends into a hopeless and vulnerable state. The never-ending stream of propaganda turns minds once capable of rational thought into playhouses of irrational forces, and with chaos swirling around them and within them, the masses crave a return to a more ordered world.
I want to see if Americans are willing to arrest those others who refuse to take this coronavirus vaccine, violating the most fundamental rights of one's personal liberty. You know, a lot of people still haven't taken the vaccine with everything that's going on, so we're trying to mandate the vaccination. No, we want to start arresting them if they're not going to be taking that.
Are you kidding me?
That's what the petition is for, sir. You know,
that's fascism, man.
quick, we support mandating the vaccine. A lot of people still refusing to take it, and they're putting the rest of us at risk. So we're going to start mandating the vaccine or start arresting these anti-vaxxers if they're not going to follow the rules. Birth date and a signature. I don't want to hear any of this my body, my choice stuff in today's New World Order. We're gonna put things right.
Absolutely, we don't need that.
Thank you. So we're gonna start having them arrested if they refuse.
I agree.
Print, birth date, signature to incarcerate the anti-vaxxers. I'm not sure what country they think they're living in. Some people are concerned about any possible long-term side effects that haven't shown up in studies yet, but the time to worry about that's in the future. So for now, they can worry about that in jail if they refuse to take the vaccine. It's time for some firm measures to take care of these people, and you know, they can. Well, it's time to give them a little incentive, and they can think about what they've done sitting in jail until they're ready to take the jab. Thank you. We signed the petition to start arresting these anti-vaxxers that haven't got the vaccine yet.
You want to arrest people for not getting a vaccine?
They're contributing to the Delta variant being spread. No. Yeah, just to mandate the vaccine for everybody, or to stop the anti-vaxxers. It's time to start arresting them if they refuse. And drastic measures to resolve these issues. So the governor just mandated it for all healthcare workers today.
Good.
And so we're going to mandate it for everybody, or they can sit in jail and think about what they've done.
Yeah, the Delta variant is on them.
It's the primary strain in many areas now. Thank you very much. Thank you for your concern for others. We want to mandate the vaccine. A lot of these anti-vaxxers are still refusing to get vaccinated, but we still need some more signatures to make sure that we can arrest them if they refuse. Mandate the vaccine. We're going to force them to take it. Yeah, print, birth date, and a signature. You know, it's been long enough for them to make a decision, so we're going to make that decision for them. And if they refuse to take it, we're going to have them arrested. Thank you for your support.
The would-be totalitarians can now take the decisive step. They can offer a way out and a return to order in a world that seems to be moving rapidly in the opposite direction. But all this comes at a price. The masses must give up their freedom and cede control of all aspects of life to the ruling elite. They must relinquish their capacity to be self-reliant individuals who are responsible for their own lives, and become submissive and obedient subjects sent into the delusions of the totalitarian psychosis. The totalitarian systems of the 20th century represent a kind of collective psychosis. Whether gradually or suddenly, reason and common human decency are no longer possible in such a system. There is only a pervasive atmosphere of terror and a projection of the enemy, imagined to be in our midst. Thus society turns on itself, urged on by the ruling authorities.
What is brainwashing? Let's listen to the explanation of Richard Grannon, which is really brilliant.
In thinking about this and simplifying it, what do we mean when we're talking about covert narcissism? In essence, expand your sort of thinking of the word covert. Covert anything. Covert manipulation, covert bullying, covert operations, covert intelligence gathering. It means it's covered. It means it's under the surface. It means that the predator that is operating while seeking its psychological prey, its emotional prey, the narcissistic supply that the predator is looking for, it's operating under the radar. It's operating in secret. Why is this such a problem for the target? Well, because for the person who is being preyed upon, the person who is being abused in this narcissistic predatory context is never quite sure whether they are being preyed upon or not.
Exactly.
Where in the early days of doing these sessions with people that focused more on narcissistic abuse, either in an interpersonal relationship or in a family relationship, we came up with the, she happened to live in a country of the former Soviet Union. So we would joke about this, kind of dark humor. We were joking about gulags, running different gulags. And I would say, well, in my gulag, I beat my prisoners and I tell them, I hate you, filthy prisoners, because you're enemies of the Communist Party and you deserve this pain. And every day at 4 o'clock, I hose them down with cold water and then give them a good beating. In her gulag, she does exactly the same thing. She hoses them down with cold water and she beats them with rubber pipes on the feet or whatever, whatever the abusive thing is. But she tells them that she loves them. She tells them that though they're enemies of the Communist Party, they were mistaken, they were confused, and that she loves them and that she wants to accept them back in to the fold, into the warm heart of communist brotherhoodness. Now, you might think this is a silly example, but this actually did happen. The very term brainwashing that we use in English is an anglification and bastardization of a Chinese communist term that I think was either called, I think the word that they use in Chinese implies mind or heart, heart washing, cleansing the heart, that because the word in Chinese will imply heart, mind and spirit, cleansing the heart of impurity, of impure thoughts against the Communist Party. Why is it so much crueler in the gulag, where they are told as they're being beaten that they're in the ministry of love, not in the ministry of torture, as in 1984? Why is that so much crueler? Because if you are allowed to call abuse, abuse, if you are allowed to say, yes, I am an anti-communist, beat me all you want, you filthy communist swine, I stand in opposition to you, then your spirit won't be broken. You will know who you are. But if you are told repeatedly over days, months and years with constant exposure that you are not being beaten, that you are not hated, that you are loved, and that this is not torture. I'm not torturing you, I'm not punishing you for being an anti-communist. I love you, I am re-educating you, I am washing your heart, my brother, my sister, my comrade, Tavarish. I am cleansing your mind of these impure, filthy, capitalist thoughts that corrupt you and bind you to the great Satan of, whatever the common enemy is. Covert narcissism operates in exactly the same way. I'm not beating you, I'm loving you. I'm not hurting you, I'm your friend. I'm not the predator, I am the prey. So I need to wrap this up because it's nearly 5 minutes. Where I prey upon you, I am the covert narcissist. I prey upon you. But even as I prey upon you, I am telling you, brainwashing you, propagandizing you into believing that I am not a predator. I am not preying upon you. I am not drinking your milkshake. Even as the straw is in my mouth and I'm slurping away, I'm looking at you and saying, I'm not drinking your milkshake. This is not happening. And not only that, but I am not a predator. I am the prey. I am the victim here. I am the victim. You, in fact, are abusing me. So here's what then happens in this echo chamber of insanity, is you get covert and inverted narcissists accusing people of narcissism even as they are narcissistically consuming them. So it would be like the praying mantis eating the head of another mantis, and even as they're eating that head going, why are you eating my head? Why do you devour me this way, you filthy creature? Even as they are hitting you, they cry out in pain. Even as you are struck by the covert narcissist, they hit you and they say ow. They attack you and then they shrink away in terror. What would the effect of this be? So imagine in this crazy gulag that gets even crazier. My gulag, I just beat people and I'm just like, you filthy anti-communist, how could you, I'll force you at gunpoint to kiss this picture of Stalin. But in my client's gulag, in the other gulag, where she tells them she loves them and that this is for their own good and that this is for their own education, What if it went even crazier? What if in her crazy gulag, every time a prison guard beat a prisoner across the feet with that rubber hose, the prison guard said, ow, 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 why are you hurting me? Why are you doing this to me? Now, you might laugh as you think about that, but something like that goes on. It's a very silly, cartoonish, easy to envision example I'm giving you, so that you could see how crazy this is and how crazy making it would be. If indeed this did happen, how much damage would it do to you? How much damage would it do to the victim? Not only are you now suffering, see, covert narcissistic abuse is a different animal. It's a different thing. Overt narcissism is horrible. It's a disgusting thing to experience, overt narcissism. A dirtying, humiliating, spirit-destroying thing. But the covert narcissist makes you doubt your own sanity, because for the first year, 2 years, 3 years of the relationship, you'll be spending most of your time going, are they abusing me or not? Are they a predator or not? Are they the predator or are they the victim? Because you'll notice, clever people that you are becoming, clever people that we are becoming as we get wise to this game, is that they propagandize us with the notion that they are vulnerable. And there is this thing that allegedly borderline people do. Borderline, some people will say, is a form of narcissism, borderline personality disorder, which is of being the vulnerable predator and of being very ostentatiously and pretentiously and theatrically vulnerable right in front of you. Look at how poor and vulnerable and small I am and delicate and fragile, nom, 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 even as they're, devouring you from within and eviscerating you and eating your guts in front of your eyes. Which, I like using film analogies, brings me back to the idea of the Schmeagol Gollum split character, who is at times the innocent, big-eyed, he's kind of cute in a sort of hairless, toothless, grey-skinned, loincloth-wearing way, and then he switches, and when your guard is down, and you're that pleasant fat hobbit who's going, oh, maybe Schmeagol's not so bad, that's when Gollum comes out and drinks your milkshake and eats your liver while you're asleep. And not only are you being narcissistically abused, but you don't know that you're being narcissistically abused, because they are propagandizing you and brainwashing you, mind-washing you, heart-washing you into thinking that they're the victim. Which is why, when we go through the traits of covert narcissists, one of the big ones is they have a victim complex, and they're very ostentatiously full on with saying, I am not understood by this cruel world, you don't understand me, nobody understands me, I'm the biggest victim in the room. So how do you overcome that? Well, you need to learn to see abuse as abuse. When somebody is not being very nice to you, if you don't like the term abuse, if it's too psychobabbly for you or too strong for you, then just think about the ways in which this person is not very nice to you. Maybe go ahead and write them down. By giving you silly examples that are extreme and comic book and filmish inside of your head, it allows me to bring that which is invisible into the visible. Because if you are really sat there going, this is abuse and this person is mentally ill, that moment that you can actually get that foothold on sanity and say, yeah, this person ain't right, at that moment you can be saved. You can save yourself. You can break out of that prison and say, okay, there's something going on here that isn't right. It's not me, it's them.
Did you tell the committee whether or not you are now have ever been a member of the Communist Party? I believe that question also invades my right as a citizen. I believe that also invades the First Amendment. I believe that I should not engage in any conspiracy with you to invade the First Amendment.
Well, now we can't tell even from that answer whether you're a member of the Communist Party.
If you take the Fifth Amendment, you're talking about your right not to be incriminated. Well, they didn't feel they had committed any crime. Well, they believed that their freedom of speech was being abridged.
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have. Oh, well, you would? Yes. Well, you will pretty soon. Witness to this, viewers. This is the typical communist constitution. Typical communist right. Typical communist act.
In 1943, the following directive was issued from party headquarters to all communists in the United States. It read, when certain obstructionists become too irritating, label them after suitable build-ups as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic, and use the prestige of anti-fascist and tolerance organizations to discredit them. In the public mind, constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind.
It's very interesting how people get into these QAnon in specifically, but conspiracy theories in general. And in chapter 3, you lay out this idea of unfreezing, where people kind of become unmoored from their norms, their normal life. Something happens to them that they kind of change, and they're seeking out kind of a new normal. Sophia, could you kind of talk about what unfreezing actually is and how it works in this context?
Right. Unfreezing is actually a term that we talk about when we talk about radicalization to terrorism, because it is a pretty well-researched pathway to radicalization. When a person becomes disconnected from their community, their responsibilities, their home life, their work, and so there's no social norm to hold them to a standard. They maybe there is a tragedy that happened that makes them homeless, or maybe they've relocated and don't have anybody to turn to, or maybe there's a war in the region and they've become displaced. They come into the state of unfreezing, which means like they're untethered to any moral scale, any social normative system. And so they're very vulnerable to radicalization efforts, which a lot of radical groups and cults know about, and they seek out individuals in this state specifically. So, cult recruiters often go to train stations and look for people who look kind of lost and miserable, and then approach them and talk to them, because they know that in this state, if you offer the person companionship and a warm meal and a place to sleep, they will accept the ideology that comes with it without questioning it. And so what happened to us all in the past few years is a kind of a massive unfreezing. There was so much change going on politically in the United States. We had Trump presidency that was deliberately undermining traditional ways of doing things and traditional norms. And it made a lot of us question, what's right and what's wrong, and who is there to protect us versus to take advantage of us. We had a few sex scandals with figures that were until then held in very high regard. So Hollywood elite like Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby, or Washington elite like Bill Clinton or Anthony Weiner. All of these stories chipped away at our trust in institutions and the political hierarchy and the law as well. Because how could these atrocities go on for so long and nobody was there to stop them, right? And also, of course, the COVID pandemic made a particularly poignant emphasis on it. But even until then, the science and pharmaceutical industry and medical industry were being kind of shaken by a number of very public scandals that exposed abuses of their power and privilege, such as the opioid crisis and all of these, pesticides and poisons that we discover have been in our food and were covered up by an industry that was supposed to stand guard, right? So we have, a lot of us experienced something like unfreezing in its traditional sense on a very massive scale. And so we were made to question our ideas of what's right and what's wrong, what's moral, what is immoral, who is the authority that we trust. And a lot of us came out of that questioning not trusting anybody really, and seeking something completely different, like a 180-degree turn from the old. And QAnon, of course, swept in with this preposition that it's all a sham. The government is all bad people. The Hollywood elites are all pedophiles. Scientists are all quacks. And it spoke to a lot of people in the state of unfreezing, and it made them listen to whatever stories QAnon told, because in addition to this preposition, QAnon also was a community that offered support, emotional support, and companionship and somebody to talk to anytime, day or night, with very little effort. And so QAnon, in a way, was a radical movement that a lot of people gravitated to as a result of this massive unfreezing.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it, for me, it resonates because it seems very similar to what I've experienced when I've talked to conspiracy theories and the more traditional conspiracy theorists, like people who've fallen into 9/11 or even like the flat Earth people. They usually have something going on in their lives around the time that they have their red pill moment.
Yep.
And for a lot of them, it's simply being unemployed. And it's having a lot of spare time. It's the old saying, the devil will find work for idle hands to do, which is kind of true, because people's minds will go in any kind of direction when they are, like you say, kind of untethered and unfrozen. It's kind of showing how people go from this state of these unfrozen social domains through what you describe as folklore, which is this large collection of things. And I'm looking in this little diagram you have here, and you have flat Earth in folklore. How does flat Earth connect to QAnon?
I think this flat Earth is one of the narratives within folklore that speaks to people who distrust science in general. It also includes vaccine denialism and the idea that COVID was developed as a bioweapon and used by the cabal to capitalize on the pandemic and mask production and things like that. And there is a sizable proportion of QAnon followers who just distrust anything that comes out of a scientific journal, or Dr. Fauci is the evil guy for them, and so on. And to speak to what you just said, QAnon really, to put a positive spin on this disaster, if we may, QAnon really exposed to all of us whose eyes are open real problems we have with transparency in the government, with accountability of people who are the elites, with some of the unscrupulous practices among, scientists and pharmaceuticals who stand to benefit financially from covering up certain research or, doing shady research and so on. And one way to see QAnon is it's a lot of people who are hurting, not knowing what's right and what's wrong and whom to trust is a horrible place to be emotionally. And QAnon narratives is their way of coping with this hurt. Creating stories and telling our story is how we humans, are processing pain. That's why talk therapy can be really helpful.
Why talk therapy does not always work. And this is exactly why people can be attracted by pseudoscience and weird beliefs, as the lady just explained. In a place of vulnerability, you are more open for anything. You have nothing to lose, right? And on top of that, maybe you are not really educated, you didn't do your research, and you can fall into the trap of a cult. Happened to me. And I did talk therapy for about a year before all that. So, what I'm trying to say here, when you have developmental trauma, which nobody is really addressing, you have to identify the elephant in the room. And most people don't do that, because trauma is uncomfortable, and sometimes there is a lot of shame involved, and then you want to avoid it. You don't want to look into it, but it will keep bothering you. Let's let a real expert explain what trauma means.
Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Bessel Vanderkok, who has been the director of the Trauma Center here in Boston for 30 years. He's been a leader in the field of trauma since before people were so interested in trauma. He has published widely. I'm sure many of you have read his book on traumatic stress. His most recent book, The Body Keeps Score, has come out.
One of the best books out there on trauma. I highly recommend it.
As he researched the psychoneurobiology of trauma and been involved in that for a long time, his research has also explored more, you might say, unconventional approaches using yoga, using theater, EMDR, which of course is more conventional these days, but wasn't at one time. So he's not only an outstanding scientist and scholar, but an innovator, a creative thinker, and a healer. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm a clinician, scientist, so I'm not a theologian. In fact, I'm leery about theology. In that so much violence is done in the name of religion, even today in Mosul and everywhere around the world. So it's not really one of my favorite things. Contemplation, stillness, that's a different story. In that regard, how many people in this room practice yoga? Ah, nice big crowd. How many people sing in choirs and stuff like that? Good. How many people make other sorts of music? Good. See, that's the beginning, huh? Because to deal with trauma, you have to move your body. You have to move your body in unison with other people. So seeing such a large crowd of people do that, encouraging to me. And of course, that's been one of the tasks of religion since time immemorial, that when people are bereft and miserable, is to get them to move and to make movements that help them to regulate your body. And some of the things that I'll talk about, heart rate variability training and stuff like that, is common to all religions. Davening, moving, bending back and forth, activates the bodily systems that you need to re-establish a sense of ownership over your body. I think trauma has become a very inflated concept. Everything is called trauma these days. And I would just like to show you what trauma looks like. Trauma is an event that overwhelms mind and brain and destroys who you are. It's not like a bad thing. It's not like getting a bad grade, missing your MBTA, not your car falling down. No, it's about you will never be the same again. This is it. Bad stuff. And so, the earliest movies that I've been able to get hold of what trauma looks like is from the time that to me is sort of the ultimate tribute about what an insane species we are, the First World War. The First World War, to my mind, is sort of the epitome of how it sort of looks bad for us as human beings. Because usually we like to kill other people for an excuse. Because they have slaves, or because they're Shiites, or some religious stuff. But in the First World War, people had the same religion, same blue eyes, same economy, and they just went at it. And 4 years and 50 million people later, they said, what the fuck did we do? But not very long, because 18 years later, the next war broke out. So we are a very crazy species. And so technology allows us to see what it looks like. So this is the earliest movies about shell-shocked soldiers.
First World War, a new condition emerged that caught the military and medical establishment completely off guard. There was no telling who would be affected by it or why. Those who suffered from it might be hypnotized or electrocuted, arrested or shot, all for the same illness. So many men were lost to it, there would be a revolution in military attitudes and a new field of medicine created. The condition was called shell shock.
These are the men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed.
And what you see here is this is not a mental event. This is not a psychological event. These are bodies that are stuck in trauma. And people's bodies are stuck in trauma. Once you get traumatized, your body is different. Your talk is different also, your mind is different. But that's not the biggest thing. Is you're filled up with impulses, sensations, feelings in your body that make you do things that you have no control over. Usually things that have to do with the trauma, where you usually suddenly lash out, or this guy is told the word bomb, and he hears the word bomb, he jumps under the bed. And the next guy sees a red hat, and the red hat makes him go, and he makes him go crazy. I say it's about bodies that go crazy.
From the very outset, casualties were heavy. Soldiers returning from the front were overwhelmed by the brutality of this war. Dr. Charles Myers, a pioneering psychologist, was appalled by the suffering of trench warfare. In October 1914, he decided to offer his services to the military.
My father was very, very concerned about conditions out there, and he moved about from hospital to hospital, and in many cases he went up to the dressing stations very close to the firing line and saw these men directly they came out from the firing line, and he was pleased he was so near, because he could undertake treatment for them straight away after their disasters with the bombs.
Soon after his arrival in France, Myers treated a private who had been trapped in barbed wire in no man's land. Although several shells had burst nearby, the soldier was untouched. But ever since the explosions, he had been partially blind. Myers was intrigued. He could find no physical cause for the man's condition. Other similar cases, mostly from the ranks, soon came to his notice. In February 1915, he reported his findings to the Lancet and concluded that the bursting of a shell had caused an invisibly fine molecular commotion in the soldier's brain. In other words, a physical shock to the nervous system had caused the strange symptoms. From this, he coined the term shell shock.
So I think it was a wonderful term because it described it quite perfectly.
To the Army's alarm, more and more cases of shell shock began to appear. After just 6 months of war, 15% of the British Army was judged to be suffering from the condition. The most extreme cases were blind, deaf, mute, or shaking, yet all without an apparent cause, other than their proximity to bombardment. Similar cases appeared in the French and German armies on the Western Front.
The shell-shocked are the symptoms of a mental purging. All the signs and symptoms, shaking, head shaking, hands shaking, body shaking, they were, in other words, they weren't themselves. They had to be nursed, taken to the toilets and all that sort of business. They weren't fit to be left on their own. I mean to say, if you had a few shells bursting round you, you wouldn't feel so happy, would you?
So what is shell shock exactly? Another great expert on trauma explains it.
Hi, I'm Peter Levine, the developer of Somatic Experiencing. In this instructional video, we will present the basic ideas behind this naturalistic approach to the transformation of trauma and the healing of stress-related disorders.
I'm Steve Hoskinson, and I train people, professionals all over the world, in somatic experiencing. You may not know this, but somatic experiencing is taught on every continent of the globe. It's taught to professionals from neuroscientists to psychologists to body workers, and every one of them is interested in the better working with trauma. Now, we understand trauma not only from the perspective of some kind of event, but we look at trauma from the nervous system perspective. And what we need to do in order to work with trauma, and what you can learn to do to work with trauma, is to see how this happens in the nervous system. See, the state of the art in terms of trauma treatment right now is exposure therapy. Those exposure therapies are largely based on content-driven exposure. We don't look at content per se. We look at the actual arousal cycles in the nervous system and train people to see the subtle signs of those activations and be able to work effectively with them.
When out of the blue we perceive threat, our bodies definitively react to protect ourselves. We do this with stiffening, with retracting, we do it with fight or flight, we do it with freezing or collapse. These emergency reactions are meant to be temporary. However, what happens in trauma is that our bodies and brains become stuck. Our necks and shoulders stiffen, our guts go into knots, our breathing quickens and goes in the upper part of our chest. Our heart beats wildly. Or, alternatively, we collapse into helplessness.
The British medical journals stirred up interest by reporting examples such as a sergeant with a paralyzed trigger finger who could no longer fire a rifle. The term shell shock became the common description for any soldier suffering an unexplained problem. Preventative measures had to be taken. In March 1915, the Army appointed Dr. Myers as consultant neurologist to deal with the growing problem. But Myers was already concerned that the term shell shock was a complete misnomer.
He found that many of the casualties who were labeled under that definition had never been near a bomb to suffer from the shell shock that most people feel associated with bombardment.
Myers realized that the causes of shell shock were far more complex than he'd first thought. He was now convinced that shell shock was not a physical problem, but a mental one. Soldiers' unconscious minds, so distressed by war, crippled their bodies and took them out of the fighting. The military found it hard to accept such a radical theory. It undermined the belief that men could and should control their fears and emotions. Captain Herbert Leland was an officer in his mid-40s who had fought in numerous campaigns. From the trenches, he wrote almost daily to his wife, Lena. His letters are the personal testimony of a man's struggle to maintain his sanity.
I was at the front this morning. You could not believe the scene of desolation. Mud, muck, misery and melancholy reign supreme, and a pitiless bombardment adds to the general discomfort. Death and glory, I suppose they call it. All my friends are gone. Not a soul to go to, even for a chat. How I do wish I could tell you some things. I dare not, of course, for you would never get my letters.
One of the senior officers saw my grandfather and said, Leland, these bombs don't seem to affect you. And he says, little does he know. But what is the point of hiding? You get used to it, but it still actually affects you very much.
When you see so much death, you obviously believe that perhaps the next bullet or the next barrage will have your name on it. And it is fearful. Some weeks, some people were frightfully brave, and yet the following week, they could hardly hold things together at all. It's a variable entity. Fear of death, fear of being afraid, seeing so much death. Really a nightmare. So how do you cope with it? I don't know. How do you prepare for it? I don't know.
These are all things that our body does immediately and instinctively to protect ourselves. To protect ourselves from the initial and the actual threat. However, when this reaction becomes chronic, we develop the debilitating symptoms of trauma. From this point on, our bodies continue to signal to our brains that we're in danger, and hence we perceive threat where it doesn't exist, until we're able to change the internal sense of our bodies. We will remain traumatized because our bodies will be continuing to send that message up to the brain. In somatic experiencing, i.e. the experience of the body, individuals are guided to change their bodily experience, and in doing so, move out of trauma. They learn that they can shift from fixity and helplessness to flow, vitality, and wholeness. What you see illustrated in this diagram is the evolution of our nervous system's response to threat. The oldest survival system is the primitive, non-myelinated or dorsovagal system. 400 million years ago, it made its first appearance in the jawless fish, creatures that live on the bottom of the ancient ocean. The survival function of this system is the shutdown response to conserve energy. If we experience mortal threat, what we do is we lay low, we don't move. Our whole breathing, our respiration, our heart rate is decreased to just barely enough to survive. Next in the evolutionary timeline, to the reptilian period, the system that mobilizes vast amount of energy that are needed for terrestrial life, basically the fight or flight response. Finally, in the higher mammalian and primate species, a breathtaking refinement took place. The new addition for these higher mammals and primates is what Dr. Steve Porges called the social engagement system. The function of this advanced system is to seek safety in group affiliation. Often this is with face-to-face emotional contact. This is a further illustration of what Stephen Porges calls the polyvagal theory of emotion. The social engagement system involves the most recent parts of our brain in the prefrontal areas of the neocortex. As you can see from this chart, this system allows us to be in relationship, not just with members of the opposite sex, as in the illustration, but with each other. Then, if this doesn't resolve the threat, or if the threat is perceived to be mortal, then the most primitive system, the system involved with immobilization, takes over. And as you see in the bottom part of the figure, this system shuts down our lungs, our hearts, puts our guts into overdrive. It overactivates our intestines and therefore creates symptoms of gastrointestinal distress. These are profound nervous system states, the states I just described. We can't talk the person out of fight or flight or shutdown. It has virtually no effect on those systems. We are able to get some soothing with our voice and with our facial expression, but once that has been hijacked by the sympathetic or the shutdown state, we lose what makes us the most human. It's through body sensation that we're able to actually move out of shutdown, move into arousal, fight or flight type states, and then return to social engagement. And the SE therapist helps track the client moving through these different states until they come back to relaxation and feelings of goodness and wholeness.
guy went and turned on me just as I shot, and I got him just back of the front shoulder. I got him in the ribs instead. But a big male like that should be okay. It's a good thermoregulating area. Hi! Get an animal like that, he's just... Still blinking there on this little... Oh, that's all right. He's just perfect. He's absolutely perfect. See the size of getting a bit bigger neck and so on, yeah. So. Holy snapper. He's about as big framed as you'll probably get. If you watch that animal after he finishes convulsing, you'll see, because he's aware of the fact that we're all around him, and it's a very stressful experience for an animal like a polar bear. After he settles down, and then he'll start doing a couple of deep breaths, and then he'll breathe really nicely, and it'll here he goes. See how he's breathing there now? You can see, so that even though it looks a little unpleasant to look at him convulsing like that, in fact, it lets off all that stress, and he then is able to relax and sleep the thing off.
We are frightened and are being held down by somebody. It's the combination of the fear and the immobility that keeps us in the trauma response. And the key, actually, to coming out of trauma back into life, in principle, quite simple. It's to uncouple the fear from the immobility. You see, because immobility by itself is not intrinsically fearful. And in this next clip, you'll see an example of this, where a mother leopard is carrying her cub with her mouth, and you'll see the cub is just limp and is not at all frightened. As a matter of fact, this is, people report immobility without fear is often experienced as being pleasurable, sometimes even profoundly pleasurable, almost blissful. As we begin to come out of the arousal state, we move towards the restoration of the active response when the person is able to go out of the immobility. When they're guided by the therapist to come out of the immobility and shut down, they move into a state of arousal which you can work with. This is the mobilization for fight or flight. So just as they come out of the immobility, they may feel the impulse to move with their arms and their legs as though they were running. And again, the idea is not just to voluntarily run, but to feel the running response, the fight or flight response from the inside, and being able to complete it in a way that feels successful and feels pleasurable and mostly feels empowering.
I was trained in psychoanalysis, and I was trained as a verbal psychotherapist. And I love the power of language, and I love the power of people being able to tell their truth, being able to speak about what happened to you and finding resonance is one of the glories of being a human being, the purpose of psychotherapy, and it can make an enormous change in people's minds and brains. Sadly, what my and other people's research showed is that talking about terrible things doesn't quite make it go away. And so I was in this awkward position of having written 2 books about traumatic stress and being considered one of the world's experts in traumatic stress back in 1994. But there was a little thing missing there, is I had no treatment chapters. You can be a great expert in something without having a treatment chapter. It's great. Because I didn't know how to treat it. because I was trained as a verbal psychotherapist, and I could talk stories, and I could be empathic with my patients. And fundamentally, it didn't change. And then some people in my clinic started to do something really weird. They started to wiggle their fingers in front of people's eyes while people were remembering their trauma. And they were very enthusiastic about it. And I'm a young Harvard professor at the time, and I tell people, stop that immediately. We are a respectable group of people, and we're not do things like wiggling our fingers in front of people's eyes and stuff like that. They did it anyway. And they happened to be some of the most talented people I'd working for me, for smart and wonderful people. And at some point they sent somebody to convert me, because it's all about religion. And they sent Steve Lazaroff to show me a movie. And I reluctantly watched this movie.
So this is Dr. Jennifer Sweeten. She's an expert on EMDR. And she explains what the bilateral stimulation actually does in classic EMDR.
Topic is BLS/DAS. So BLS stands for bilateral stimulation. DAS stands for dual awareness stimulation. So if you have had any exposure to EMDR, either as a client or as a clinician, you know that there's kind of this magical quality to it that I think is kind of a turnoff to some people and maybe is intriguing to other people. But the piece of it that seems sort of mystical and a little bit confusing is the eye movements. Okay, so if you're a client and you've done EMDR, you know that usually the therapist is moving their fingers and you're watching them go back and forth. You may alternatively had EMDR where you have the little sensors in your hand called the TheraTapper, these little buzzies in your hand. And in both cases, you've probably noticed that it's been bilateral. So you're moving your eyes from one side to the other, or you're having this bilateral tactile stimulation, one hand and then the other. I think some therapists do a really good job at explaining this, but I find in some of my trainings that even therapists who've been doing EMDR for a while don't always have a good understanding of what the hypotheses are behind BLS, and so it can be good to understand this. I think not only if you're a client, but also if you're a clinician doing EMDR, it can be helpful to know why exactly we're doing this. So the application of BLS, that bilateral movement or stimulation, is really a key aspect of EMDR. And in my opinion, it's one of the main things that separates EMDR from other therapies. Because without that, a lot of what EMDR is maybe a little bit of focus on somatic work and a lot of cognitive restructuring. And in a lot of ways, it's good old-fashioned exposure therapy. EMDR different is the application of the BLS-DAS. So why are we doing this? Let me start off with a little bit of a history about this. We associate this with EMDR, and there's no question that Francine Shapiro was an absolute genius, totally discovered this on her own, where she was walking through the forest, and she was thinking about something traumatic. This is how the story goes. Around 1989, and she's walking, and she's darting her eyes back and forth as she's walking through the forest, thinking about something really distressing, and she starts to notice that the images are dulling as she's doing this. So the memories are getting less intense, and her experience of it is dulling, including the images. And this is really her discovery of using bilateral movement to dull or process through strong negative emotional content. Know, though, that this wasn't actually first discovered by Francine Shapiro. So yes, it was discovered by her, but it was not first discovered by her. So we think Aboriginal cultures have been using this for thousands of years. And by this, I mean incorporating bilateral movement to process strong emotions. So think especially weddings and especially funerals. In terms of using it clinically, we know it was being used clinically even in the 1700s. There's a guy named Franz Mesmer. So if you've ever heard the term getting mesmerized, that's Mesmer. Sort of inching toward the origins of hypnosis, but not quite. In the 1700s, Franz Mesmer started using bilateral movements. And then James Braid in the 1800s, we think of him mainly as the developer, I don't know if discoverer is the right word, but developer of hypnosis. He was really the first to use bilateral movements in the way that's actually very similar to how we're using them in EMDR today. So EMDR has its roots in hypnosis. Allegedly, and this source is kind of hard to track down, but allegedly also Freud used this late 1800s, where he was combining his talk therapy, psychoanalysis, with bilateral eye movements in clients. And there is some documentation of this where he talks about how effective this is, and he actually says that this is more effective than anything else had ever been. So when he's combining his talk therapy with BLS, it worked substantially better. Why this fell out of vogue, though, it's a little bit unclear, but it fell out of vogue maybe around 1900 or so. Not entirely positive about this, but at the time there were some political things happening, and there was a lot of concern at that time about witchcraft and magical things, and the theory is that he was concerned about being perceived in that way. He was quite well known and quite famous and didn't want to be perceived as a witch, or I guess a sorcerer, didn't want to be perceived as doing these things that were that had this magical or mystical quality to them. So I actually ended up abandoning this, but later wrote that nothing had worked so well. So this has been used throughout history, different times. Even the NLPers, the neuro-linguistic programming researchers around 1975 started developing neuro-linguistic programming and incorporating sometimes some BLS in that too. And then Francine Shapiro after that by about 1989. So I say all this to say that bilateral movement, bilateral stimulation is not really a new thing. It is really what makes EMDR, I think, and there's no doubt that EMDR is new, and that it was not put together in this way prior to Francine Shapiro. But know that the application of BLS is something that's been common for years, for centuries, and it's something that we know tends to work pretty well. And what I mean by that is that it helps people process negative emotional information faster than if we were to not apply the BLS. Okay, so it speeds up the process by which you process. That's basically it. There's nothing really actually super magical, I don't think, about it. But why this works so well, let me take it from a neuroscience perspective on this. Some clients are going to really appreciate this. Some really don't care. They're just going to say, whatever works, works. Just let's get this started. Other clients are going to really want to know the ins and outs and are going to be quite suspicious of this. So it can be good to have this information. Two theories about why BLS helps you process emotional information. One of them is called the working memory hypothesis, and the other one is called the interhemispheric communication hypothesis. Generally, and this is probably a little bit of an overgeneralization, but in my experience it seems to be that the working memory hypothesis is more supported by the neuroscientists broadly. Okay, so if you're a neuroscientist and you like the other theory, okay. But generally speaking, working memory hypothesis seems to be more espoused by the neuroscientists. Definitely an EMDR psychologist, but coming from a neuroscience background that's pretty strong. So I'm probably going to go a little bit more the working memory hypothesis. But here's what they are. Okay, so working memory hypothesis. This basically says that when we apply BLS when processing emotional information, it speeds up that process because the BLS takes up some working memory capacity. In other words, it's a distraction. Okay, so I know that like really demystifies it. I don't know, it's sort of, it can be kind of a downer actually to think that that's maybe all it is that you're distracted. And I don't, okay, I don't think that that's all it is, but let me say a little bit about this theory. Okay, so what we're doing in classic EMDR is we're pulling memories out of the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is this area of the brain, this limbic structure that holds long-term memories. And they're explicit, declarative, autobiographical memories. So the stuff that you can actually remember when you try to remember it. It's the hippocampus. So think about the best birthday gift you've ever gotten in your entire life, or the best Christmas gift you've ever gotten in your entire life. You'd be pulling that out of long-term memory. Okay, so explicit memory is the stuff that you can actually remember. That's different than something like implicit memory, which would involve areas of the brain more like the basal ganglia, cerebellum, amygdala. Different. Implicit memory is the stuff that you don't have explicit memory for, the stuff that you can't on purpose pull out of memory. Okay, so no conscious recall with it. And there's usually no, there's always no language to those memories. So hippocampal memories, the stuff that you can actually remember. What we're doing in classic EMDR usually is we're having people pull out stuff from the hippocampus out of long-term memory, and we're having them bring it up to these top areas here, the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in working memory, and like a million other things. But for our purposes, working memory. So you got your working memory right up here, pulling these memories out of the hippocampus into working memory. Hippocampus has a lot of storage. So long-term memory is a huge storage unit. You can store thousands of things in here, thousands of memories in the hippocampus. But working memory, we know, has a very, very small capacity. A lot less stuff can fit into working memory. So if I were to ask you to remember 100 different things all at the same time, you can't do it because your working memory capacity is not large enough. So what that means is that when we're pulling things out of long-term memory, usually we can only pull a couple of things out, or maybe one thing out at a time. Okay, so what we're doing in classic EMDR, we're pulling out these memories out of the hippocampus, bringing them up to the prefrontal cortex into working memory, which has a very small capacity. The idea is that we're holding them there in working memory and doing something with them. So every time you remember something, you actually recreate it. So we're using that strategically, where we're shifting, usually in some way or another, the client's emotional relationship to the memory. That can be changing what is emphasized. It can be shifting emotions. It can be paying attention to sensations and changing those. There's a whole lot of ways we can do this, but you're pulling it up in working memory. And when you pull up that memory in working memory, especially when it's a trauma memory, it takes up the whole darn thing. So it feels really overwhelming. It feels like they're drowning in the memory oftentimes. So it's taking up 100% of this working memory capacity. And part of that is because these memories are so intense that they demand that much attention. So what we're doing when we're applying BLS is we are forcing the BLS to take up some working memory capacity. So if I'm moving my fingers back and forth and you're watching my fingers move, your brain has to process the fingers moving. And what that does is it takes up a little bit of space in working memory. Otherwise, you'll stop moving your eyes. So to keep up with the fingers, it requires a little bit of working memory capacity. And in fact, I know that the faster I go, I don't want to go so fast that I lose a client, but the faster I go, the more working memory capacity is taken up by the BLS. The more working memory capacity that's taken up by the BLS, the less can be taken up by the traumatic memory. So it may be the case when we apply BLS that instead of 100% of your working memory capacity being taken up by the traumatic memory or the image that I'm having you focus on, maybe it's only 80%, maybe it's 90%, maybe it's 70%, but it's less. And we know that when we have people focus on a traumatic memory, but they can't fully focus on it in the same way. Okay, they can't allocate all their resources to it, their attentional resources, that it facilitates fading of the memory. Okay, so it's less vivid, and it facilitates a calmer reaction to it. So you actually react less strongly to it. So this is the desensitization piece of EMDR.
So, what has Steve done? Steve done this weird thing that they didn't get to research. It's mentioned here, actually. He says, no, EMDR is respectable. You know why it's respectable? Because I did the research. And so we went to NIMH, did the EMDR research, and what we showed actually is that EMDR turns out up to now the best treatment for a simple, relatively uncomplicated trauma like an assault or a rape. At an 80% cure rate, which nobody's ever come close to. What's interesting, right now there's a study being done that seems to be, it's going to have probably similar outcomes as we had with EMDR. It comes from a different corner. It is MNDA research. It is research on ecstasy. That's not how most respectable people think about the world. I hear about this research and I say, well, makes perfect sense. I get to know the people, very good people. What do? They give people a drug that makes their brains very calm, open, and loving. And as they take those drugs, they start revisiting that wounded self. And they say, oh my God, that's me. Back then, I was beaten up, I was raped, and they develop compassion for themselves as it happened to them. That's very similar to what we do in EMDR and other things. You help people to be in a mindful, safe place where they can observe without getting hijacked what happened to them. And if you do that, you can integrate the experience and say, this happened to me a long time ago. It sucked, but it's over. It doesn't happen anymore. And so those are the two treatments that I know for sure. No, actually, I know one for sure here, there, and the other one looks very promising. That can have very profound capacities to help people to integrate the trauma. Here's another thing. So therapists are very much into people's minds, and they are not much into bodies and organisms. But I'd like to invite you to just imitate the way that this person sits for a second. So she has her chair, her butt slightly lifted out of her chair. Her shoulders are sort of up like this. Now sit like this. And now say, boy, I really love being here today. That's how our patients sit. And as long as you sit like this, you're not capable of feeling joy, pleasure, openness to other people. And this whole dimension of the body determining what our mind can do is basically non-existent in therapy. And when you actually talk about it, you say, oh, he's this alternative person. Really? Hands on your lap. She shows us a sternocleidomastoid muscle. It's a muscle of curiosity. And her shoulders are down and back. So can I just see that? See your shoulders go down and back. Lift your neck a little bit. And now say, I hate Dick Cheney. Even I can't hate Dick Cheney when I sit like that. Because when you hold your body in a certain position, you cannot do the hating thing. You cannot do the worry thing. And what's fascinating to me is how in our world of Western medicine, psychology, social work, and even religion, this is not a familiar posture. After my last visit to the Louvre last year, I decided not to go to the Louvre anymore. I am sick of guys with plumes on horses strutting along. And I'm much more sympathetic to Southeast Asian art, where people sit like that. It's not part of our traditions. It's also not very much part of our religious traditions. It's there. A few people sit out and they meditate. As it turns out, that this particular position is just about the only position through which you can change your brain. Which is sort of important if you are a traumatized person. Because unless you get into a deeply interoceptive mode, where you contemplate your internal experience, you cannot change your internal experience. So you can keep putting it out there and talk politics and talk about all these horrible people, but if you really want to change the way you feel, the way you organize your internal reality, you have to go inside. That means that you have to shut up. My hunch is that any treatment that can help people to feel deeply calm and self-observant can have those effects.
That's as much scientific knowledge as you can get, right?
How do you define trauma?
Trauma is an injury, is a wound. Mm-hmm. It's something happens to you that is too big for your mind to comprehend. It's overwhelming by definition. It's too much, and so that because of that, the consequence of that is that you get stuck, and things keep coming back, and you get overwhelmed again, and your mind and your brain and your being is incapable of comprehending and making sense out of that event, and because you cannot integrate it, it keeps coming back. Trouble is that when traumatized people start trying to become mindful, they run into a minefield inside because all that trauma sits inside of you, and as you get to know yourself, you get to see how much you hate yourself, you know yourself, you can't stand what you have done or how weak you are. And so it becomes very painful.
And already Alice Miller wrote the book Drama of the Gifted Child. Poisonous Pedagogy in Primal Therapy. Dear Mrs. Miller, I've read all your books, and I read all the mails on your website. These days I struggle with my anger and hate. I feel in some social situations with friends, etc. I know that these situations are symbolic for my youth with my sadistic mother. I have a question about therapy of Ingeborg Bosch. Past reality integration. Do you think her therapy is free of poisonous pedagogy? I have had therapy of her some time and it helped me, and it's still helping me to identify my emotions as adequate in the current situation or as a result of a symbolic situation from my youth. But I have a question about the Pry concept of false power. Pry says that anger, hate is false power, and a defense against the pain of the child when the parents were abusing the child. According to Pry, feeling the hate is not helping you. Feeling how it felt being a powerless child, being abused by the powerful parents is bringing health. I'm very interested in your opinion on this subject. Thank you for your great books and website, the Netherlands. Alice Miller responds, I totally disagree with this theory and think, like you, that it shows indeed traces of poisonous pedagogy as the rage and anger are condemned by all religions. However, these emotions are the most natural, healthy and logical reactions to endure pain. Since these emotions are forbidden for children, they must be suppressed, in contrast to sadness, which is allowed. Neither in family nor in school are these important and life-protecting emotions allowed to be felt and expressed in words. They must thus stay blocked in our bodies and produce corporal symptoms in order to be heard. If they are taken seriously in adulthood, these emotions can be felt in therapy and then the symptoms may disappear. Because their only one concern was to rebel against injustice, cruelty, perversion, hypocrisy, lies, and the lack of love. All this bitterness was locked in the body without any outlet. Now in therapy, they must be respected by a therapist who is not afraid of them. If instead clients should believe that their rage is only a defense against sadness and an illusion of false power, they will again be hindered to admit exactly this emotion that blocks the functioning of their bodies and whose liberation would be healthy for an adult. Apparently the fear of the little child, of the next blow that still lives within us, penetrates also many concepts of therapy, primal therapy not excluded. We prefer to stay good, obedient children of the kindergarten, who rather do dare to cry without end, than to become adults who can feel the endless injustice they had to endure in their childhood and rebel against it. In my opinion, the adult must dare exactly that. I can highly recommend it. There is even a YouTube version where you can just listen to the audio for free. An unpretentious little book with an amazing impact. Many readers find themselves portrayed with an accuracy and empathy that seem uncanny, as if the author had been a silent, unseen witness to their childhoods and their innermost and secret selves. Narcissism has rarely been written about with the clarity and quiet insight of this modest, thought-provoking work that is remarkably free of psychoanalytic jargon. Miller's succinct little book makes an eloquent case for psychoanalytic insight. A book that patients prescribe. The therapists are reading it because the patients are recommending it. Full of wisdom and perception. He pointed out the problem of toxic pedagogy. Traumatized people will, again, traumatize other people, their kids. As long as this issue is not resolved, we will basically carry on. So you inherit trauma from your family if this issue is not resolved. And how do you resolve this issue? Talk therapy isn't the key. Talk therapy is important, definitely, especially when you had an environment that forbid you to talk. You were not allowed. Well, a cult is one of those examples. You are never allowed to address inconsistencies. You are not allowed to point out or question certain things, or else you are excommunicated, and you don't want that, right? You want to stay in the group that felt so warm and fuzzy at the beginning. So, talking about your cult experience, that's very important, I agree. However, developmental trauma from childhood, that's a different thing. You also have to address the nervous system. Let's listen again to the expert, Dr. Bessel Vanderkok.
Of our and other people's previous research is that an engine of how trauma lives itself out is that the fear center of your brain keeps running away with you. So you're always on. Anyway, always feeling I'm in danger. And your conscious mind can tell you, don't be stupid, you shouldn't feel that way, but that part of your brain keeps running. Now, so we do neurofeedback and we calm that part of the brain down. And we can see how it calms itself down, we can see how the EEG changes, and then we look at how the symptoms change. And much to my amazement, the big change is not picked up by how fearful people feel, but in people's executive functioning. Whether they can look in the future, whether they have a sense of after this something else will come. And the capacity to say, yeah, yesterday I did this, but today I need to do something slightly different.
So I want to make sure I understand this. You're not getting an extinction function or a counter-conditioning process the way you might in CBT. You're getting a kind of a parallel track, the ability of somebody to think as well as to feel.
And so, but we calm down a certain part of the brain, and the brain is tracks. It's about stuff, part of the brain communicating to each other, and as this part of the brain calms itself down, this part of the brain starts coming online. So that's fascinating. So as long as that part of the brain is firing and telling you you're in danger, you are always uptight. And when that part of your brain comes down, you become a more reasonable, generous person. So you calm down a particular part of the brain, and then we do this. We study ERPs, evoked response potential. So that tells you something how well the brain is able to focus and to filter out irrelevant stimuli and to stay focused. And what you see is that the ERP dramatically improves. And so suddenly people are able to learn. Now, one of the striking things about traumatized people is they get traumatized over and over again. Most people in a more or less same frame of mind, after you date one alcoholic guy who beats up in a drunken rage, you go like, next time I date a drunk guy who gets drunk, I'm going to stay away from him. But when you're traumatized, it seems like reality seems to have no impact on you, and you do the same stupid stuff over and over again. And people become impatient with you. And so what we see, if you do neurofeedback with people, is that they seem to be able to begin to learn from experience. It's not bad.
Yep, I agree, not bad. But my insurance completely refuses to look into that. And that's that narrow-minded belief system. And you find that not only in cult followers, but you find that on the other side, on the scientific side as well. And we need to differentiate between true, good science that is ready to change its views when the evidence points toward it, and mad science who does not listen and just wants to push through whatever it wants to achieve. This is dangerous, and it will destroy us. We need true science. And a balanced approach to everything. We need both hemispheres, the left side as well as the right side. Otherwise, we have just one side of a coin. But we need the whole perspective. Always ready to look at all the data. Open-minded, present. And therefore I understand people get disenchanted because they don't get any help with the conventional methods. So of course it's only common sense. You want to feel better, so you look into other directions. You start to do your own research and you do other things to help yourself, which is outside conventional therapies. And there is a thin line to cross where you can get conned by people who pretend to be healers. And they pull you in and pull a lot of money out of your pocket. It's a very thin line, and you have to be very careful whom you can trust in this field. Due diligence is important. Always do your research and always check out a person who calls themselves a healer or whatever, always check out their credentials, because so many can just completely fool you. A good trauma therapist should always be educated about neuroscience as well as the nervous system. And they should not only do talk therapy. That's the most important thing of all. For example, knowing about the window of tolerance is also very important. How we do bring ourselves back into the window of tolerance. They should be able to teach you that, because we aren't primitive animals. We have our upstairs brain, the part of our brain that can self-reflect, observe and make wise responses to the situations around us. When our downstairs brain kicks into high gear, energy gets diverted away from the upstairs brain. Hence why, when you're completely overwhelmed and flooded with anger, fear or sadness, being articulate and clear seems to be close to impossible. When we help our upstairs brain, meaning prefrontal cortex, come back alive, we can support our nervous systems in returning to our window of tolerance, where we can then make those wise decisions on how to respond to the situation in front of us. The visual image of the window of tolerance can come in handy. Here, if you think about energy. It takes a lot of energy to fight something and a lot of energy to run away. So, if we are experiencing a fight or flight response and want to return to our window of tolerance, this is this middle range here, we need to utilize skills that bring our energy back down. Splash cold water on your face or use ice on the insides of your wrists or behind your earlobes. Take deep breaths. Sometimes big, intentional yawn can help. Use essential oils, candles or other things with a pleasing, calming scent. Breathe deeply. Place both feet on the ground, wiggle your toes. Really feel your feet on the ground. Draw as much attention and energy down through your feet. Step outside, feel the weather. Maybe even touch the ground with your bare feet. And you can place your hand on your prefrontal cortex area. This is also very calming, and it will actually improve blood circulation in this area. And then you can do the basic exercise from Rosenberg, which is also very helpful. Alternatively, if you are in a frozen state, you'll have low energy and skills that bring your energy up. So you can pull, push or throw something, ideally with some resistance. Choose things that aren't going to cause any damage to self, others or property. Pulling a strap or rope, pushing a wall, or throwing small soft objects generate energy. Find a sturdy wall Place both hands on the wall and gently begin to lean push into the wall. Any short movements that increase heart rate, even just swinging your arms. Sit on an exercise ball or talk. Jump on a trampoline or do some silly movements with your children or upbeat music, dancing. Use essential oils, candles or other things with a pleasing, invigorating scent. You can also massage yourself or be massaged by another if this is pleasant to you. So a good trauma therapist should always teach you such skills. To help these regulation skills become instinctual, we have to start using them as often as possible when we are inside our window of tolerance, otherwise we'll never use them when we're outside of it. The beauty of this is that the more we practice regulation skills, the more comfortable we become at the edges of our window of tolerance. And the more comfortable we become at the edges, the wider the window will become, which is a good thing. Because you can then be more resilient to stress. The wider the window becomes, the more capable we'll feel facing the challenges of our lives before becoming flooded with a fight-flight-freeze response. When we work in partnership with the incredible systems within us, our mental and emotional well-being can improve. While these skills may seem simple, it may be incredibly difficult to put them into practice. Oftentimes, finding safe places with another person who can help us regulate, called co-regulating, can have a powerful and profound impact on us. And that's why I'm saying a therapist needs to feel safe, needs to be present, and they need to also have worked on their own nervous system because of that co-regulation. When they know how to regulate themselves, they will automatically also regulate us in their presence. That's why this is so important. So, a trauma therapist should support you and your nervous system through therapy, not agitate you even more or re-traumatize you even. Always keep that in mind.